After my divorce, I took a job as a delivery driver to survive. That line might sound dramatic, but it's the truth. 1 year ago, I was a project manager for a construction firm in Portland, Oregon, with a decent salary, a 3-bedroom house, and a wife who swore we were in it for life. Now I rent a small apartment behind a laundromat. My savings are gone, and my days start with cheap coffee and end with back pain from lifting boxes. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to smell the lavender candle my ex used to light at night. Then I remember that she took everything, even the damn candle holders. Driving deliveries wasn't the plan. It was survival. I signed up for every app I could find, grabbed a used Ford Transit, and hit the road. The routes took me anywhere from fancy downtown condos to rundown trailers. Most people didn't even make eye contact when they took their packages. I didn't care. I just wanted the miles, the pay, the distraction from the silence waiting at home. That afternoon, it started raining. One of those cold Oregon rains that soaks you from the inside out. I had 3 stops left. The last one stood out on my route sheet: Whitmore Estate, Old Pine Road, Silverton. I almost laughed. An estate, people still called their homes, that I figured it was just another rich guy's mansion where I'd have to buzz through a gate and drop off some imported wine or overpriced tech gadget. The drive took me 30 minutes off the main highway. The closer I got, the quieter it became. No houses, no streetlights, just fog and endless pine trees leaning over the road like they wanted to swallow it whole. My GPS kept losing signal, but I finally spotted the gate. It was iron, tall, and rusted in spots, with a small brass sign that read, Whitmore Estate. Behind it, I could barely see the outline of a massive old house on a hill, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a different century. I pressed the intercom. Static. I pressed again. Nothing. I was about to turn back when a voice cracked through. Yes, it was deep, slow, cautious. Delivery for Mr. Whitmore. I said, package from Portland Logistics. There was a long pause. Then the gate clicked open. My stomach did a weird flip. Something about that pause felt heavy, like whoever answered wasn't sure whether to let me in. I drove up the gravel path. Wet leaves stuck to my tires. The mansion came into view piece by piece, ivy crawling up gray stone walls, windows with heavy curtains drawn shut, an old oak door with black iron handles. I parked near the steps, grabbed the package, and jogged up to the porch. Before I could knock, the door opened. An old man stood there, tall but frail, with silver hair combed back and a cane in one hand. His eyes locked on my face. He didn't move, didn't even blink. For a second I thought he was having a stroke. Then his lips trembled, and I saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. I froze, awkward, holding the box between us. Sir, I've got a delivery for a Mr. George Whitmore, I said. He still didn't answer. His face went pale, like he was staring at a ghost. Finally he whispered, barely audible, You're a Thompson, aren't you? My hand almost dropped the package. What I said, I think you've got the wrong guy. He stepped closer, shaking his head slowly. No. It can't be. You have his eyes. Edward's eyes. His voice cracked on the name. Who's Edward? I asked. I don't know any Edward. The man covered his mouth with his hand and turned away, his shoulders shaking. I could hear him quietly crying. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was dementia. Maybe he was confusing me with someone else. Maybe he was just lonely and needed to talk. I took a small step back. Sir, if you could just sign for the package, I'll be on my way. He didn't respond. After a moment he wiped his face, turned around, and looked at me again. Calmer this time. Please, he said. Come in for a minute. Out of the rain. It's important. Every rule from delivery training screamed no. But something in his voice made me hesitate. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. I looked back at my van through the rain, then at him, and nodded. All right. Just for a minute. The warmth hit me as soon as I stepped inside. The hallway smelled of old wood and lemon polish. Portraits lined the walls. Faces of men in suits and women in pearl necklaces, staring down like silent witnesses. The man closed the door behind me and leaned on his cane. "My name is George Whitmore," he said. "I've lived here my whole life. And you are?" "Daniel," I said. "Daniel Thompson." The moment the name left my mouth, he exhaled sharply, almost like a gasp. "Thompson," he repeated. His eyes filled again, and I swear I saw him smile for the first time. "I knew it. I knew one of you would come back someday." I didn't understand what he meant, but I couldn't look away from the portrait near the staircase. It showed a young man in a World War II uniform, confident grin, blue eyes, and a scar above his left eyebrow. The resemblance was undeniable. It was like staring at a younger version of myself. The old man followed my gaze. "That's Edward," he said softly. "Your grandfather." I turned to him, stunned. "That's impossible. My grandfather died before I was born. My dad barely talked about him." George shook his head. "He didn't die the way they told you." His voice trembled. "There are things you don't know about your family, Daniel. Things that were buried for 70 years. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but he was already walking deeper into the house, motioning for me to follow. "There's something I need to show you," he said. Something Edward wanted his bloodline to see when the time was right. I stood there for a second, soaked and unsure whether to follow him or turn around and pretend this never happened. But curiosity, that dangerous spark, had already lit up inside me. I set the package on the floor and took a slow step forward, down the hall that smelled of dust and memory, toward the man who cried when he saw my face. He led me into a long corridor where the air felt thick with age. The floor creaked under every step and my wet shoes left faint marks on the wood. Paintings of stern-faced men hung on the walls, each one dressed like they'd stepped out of another century. I couldn't shake the feeling that all those painted eyes were following me. George stopped in front of a heavy door at the end of the hallway. He rested his hand on the brass handle as if hesitating to open it. "This was your grandfather's study," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "It has been locked since the day he left." He pushed the door, and the hinges let out a long groan. The room smelled of old books and dust, with a large desk in the center, covered by a white sheet. I watched as he limped over and pulled the sheet away. Beneath it, the desk looked untouched, papers stacked neatly yellow with age, a glass of something that had long dried up, a fountain pen still resting beside it. George stood there for a moment staring at the desk like it was an altar. Then he looked at me. "You look just like him. The same jawline, same eyes." God, I never thought I'd live to see it. I didn't know what to say. My heart was beating too fast. I told him again that he must have made a mistake, but he shook his head. "No mistake, Daniel." He turned toward a tall cabinet near the fireplace, fumbled with a ring of keys, and opened the door. Inside were boxes, ledgers, and what looked like military medals. He reached into the back and pulled out a small wooden case. His hands trembled. "I kept this safe all these years because Edward asked me to. He said that if his blood ever returned to this house, I should hand it over." He placed the case on the desk and opened it. Inside was a thick envelope, sealed with cracked red wax, and written across it in elegant cursive was the name Edward Thompson. My chest tightened. I'd heard that name before. My father had mentioned it only once when I was a teenager. He'd said his father was a disappointment, a man who ran away and left the family behind. After that, he refused to talk about him again. George slid the envelope toward me. "Your father didn't know the truth. None of them did." I didn't reach for it right away. Instead, I looked around the room again, at the books, the photographs, the old leather chair that still faced the window. There was something sad about it all, like the room had been waiting for someone to come back. "What happened to him?" I asked finally. George sat down slowly, lowering himself into the chair. He pressed his hands together and stared at the floor. Edward was the heir to the Thompson fortune. The family owned banks, land, shipping companies, everything. But he fell in love with a woman named Anna Brooks. She worked here as a maid. Back then, that was enough to ruin a man's life. I listened, not breathing. The family told him to end it. George went on. They said it would shame the Thompsons. When he refused, they cut him off, erased his name from every record. He left this house with nothing but her and a suitcase. I never saw him again after that day. My throat felt dry. My father never mentioned any of this. All he ever said was that his dad abandoned them. George nodded. That's what they wanted him to believe. Edward wrote letters for a while, but the family intercepted them. After a few years, he stopped writing. I tried to find him once, but it was too late. Then one morning a letter arrived addressed to me. It contained this envelope and a short note that said, if anyone from his bloodline ever returned, I was to give it to them. He pushed the envelope closer to me. For 70 years I've waited. I hesitated. The wax was brittle, and the paper soft. Like it could crumble if I breathed too hard. When I finally broke the seal, a faint smell of ink and smoke rose from it. Inside were 2 photographs, a folded birth certificate, and a handwritten letter. The first photo showed Edward in uniform, smiling, an arm around a woman with dark skin and kind eyes. The second was of a small boy, maybe 4 years old. I stared at it for a long moment before realizing who it had to be. My father. The letter was written in looping script. My dearest son, it began. If you ever find this, know that I loved you and your mother more than anything. I chose love over money. But the world was not ready for that choice. I hoped one day my family would see that love is not a sin. I stopped reading. My eyes burned. George's voice broke the silence. Edward wanted his descendants to know the truth. He didn't want the name Thompson to be remembered only for greed. I folded the letter carefully and looked at him. Why me? Why now? He smiled sadly. Because you came back here. Because fate works in strange ways. I leaned against the desk, trying to process everything. The rain outside hit the windows harder. The entire room felt like it was closing in. George stood again and pointed toward a portrait above the fireplace. It was Edward and Anna on their wedding day. The frame was covered in dust, half hidden behind a curtain. I stepped closer and wiped the glass with my sleeve. Beneath the grime, their smiles looked real, alive. Your grandfather was a brave man, George said quietly. He gave up everything for what he believed in. The Thompsons wanted him forgotten, but his blood still found its way home. I didn't trust myself to speak. I felt anger at my father for never searching, sadness for Edward, confusion about where this left me. George put a hand on my shoulder. You should rest a minute. You've had a long day. Then, when you're ready, there's something else you need to see. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the photographs and the smell of old paper. I sat in the chair that had once belonged to my grandfather. Outside, the rain had stopped. And for the first time that day, I noticed how quiet everything was. The kind of quiet that waits for an answer. The quiet felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat there for a long time, the letter still open in my hands, trying to imagine the man who wrote it. Edward Thompson. My grandfather. A name that had always been nothing more than a blank space in our family. Now that space had a face, a voice, and a story I didn't know how to handle. Footsteps creaked in the hallway. George came back carrying a small lamp. He set it on the desk beside me and said softly that the house gets dark fast this time of day. I nodded, barely hearing him. My mind was somewhere between disbelief and a strange ache in my chest. He pulled a chair next to me and sat down. There's something else, he said quietly. Reaching into the inside pocket of his cardigan, he took out a faded photograph, edges curled with time. It showed 2 men in army uniforms, both young, both smiling. One of them was unmistakably Edward. The other was George, years before the wrinkles and the cane. We served together in France, he said. Your grandfather saved my life when our unit was hit. After the war, we came back here, and I thought we'd build something great together. But the family never forgave him for what he'd done. I turned the photo over. On the back was written, Brothers by Choice. I looked at him, and he met my eyes without saying a word. He stood again, motioned for me to follow him down the hall. The house seemed to stretch farther than I remembered. Every hallway leading to another door. Another room full of forgotten lives. We stopped at a narrow staircase that went down. The basement, George said. I hesitated but followed him. The basement smelled of damp stone and old wood. There was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its light flickering. Against one wall stood a tall cabinet covered in a sheet. George gripped the fabric and pulled it away. Inside were boxes marked with faded handwriting. He opened one and took out a thick leather folder tied with string. "These are Edward's papers," he said. "Letters, contracts, family records. The Thompsons tried to destroy them, but I managed to keep a few." He placed the folder in front of me on a workbench. "Go ahead. Look." I untied the string and opened it. The first few pages were business documents, old bank reports, and correspondence stamped with the Thompson Holdings seal. Then I found something different. A photograph of a large house that looked exactly like this one but newer, brighter. Underneath, written in ink, were the words, "Our home," before the silence. I looked at George. "What does that mean?" He sighed. "The silence. That's what Edward called the years after he left. No word from his family. No visitors. No recognition. It was like he'd never existed. But he kept this photograph as proof that love was worth more than a name." He reached deeper into the folder and pulled out another envelope. Smaller than the first. It was sealed, but the wax had already cracked. He opened it carefully and handed me the paper inside. It was a birth certificate. The name at the top read John Edward Thompson. My father. My throat tightened. The document listed Edward as the father and Anna Brooks as the mother. My father's birth date matched exactly. I felt a wave of heat rush through me. George nodded slowly. "Your father never knew who his mother really was. The family paid to have her name erased from the public record. That's how deep their shame went." I stared at the document again. The handwriting of the registrar looked shaky, as if even the person filling it out knew it was something forbidden. My father spent his whole life believing his father abandoned him. And all along it was the family that abandoned them both. I felt anger building inside me. Not wild rage, but something colder. Heavier. George watched me carefully. "It's a lot to take in." "I know." I looked around the basement. Boxes of forgotten papers. A life buried under dust. "Why did you keep all this?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Because I promised him. Edward said the truth always finds a way home. Maybe this is it." The bulb above us flickered again and went out for a second. The basement plunged into darkness before the light came back. For a moment it felt like the house itself was breathing. George picked up one more object from a small wooden crate. It was a pocket watch. Tarnished but still beautiful. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, were the initials E.T. He placed it in my palm. "He gave me this the day he left. Said it belonged to his grandfather before him. I think it belongs to you now." I turned it over in my hand. It ticked faintly. Still alive after all these years. I could feel the pulse of it against my skin. Like a heartbeat reaching across generations. I don't know why. But I slipped it into my pocket. Maybe I just didn't want to let go of something that real. George looked tired. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a second. "The family's money couldn't erase everything," he said quietly. "I kept these things hidden from them. But they never stopped looking. If they knew you were here, they'd come again. Come again." The words hung in the air. "What do you mean they'd come?" He opened his eyes. Sharp and serious now. "Years ago, one of Edward's nephews came here asking questions. He wanted proof that Edward had no rightful heirs. I told him nothing. But he'll want to know that you exist. Daniel." The thought hit me like a weight. This wasn't just about old letters anymore. There were people out there who still wanted to bury this story. George pushed himself off the wall and started for the stairs. "I think it's time you go home for tonight," he said. "Let the truth settle. Come back tomorrow and I'll show you the rest." I followed him up the steps, the sound of our shoes echoing off the stone. When we reached the main hall, the light from the setting sun spilled through the tall windows, painting the room in gold and red. At the door, he turned to me and smiled. Tired but kind. "You've brought something back to this house, Daniel. For 70 years it was nothing but ghosts. Now it finally feels alive again." I nodded, unsure what to say. I walked out into the damp air, the gravel crunching under my feet. My van waited at the end of the drive. I glanced back once. The old man was still standing in the doorway watching me. For a moment, I thought I saw someone else in the window above him. Just a shadow. Then it was gone. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled away. The trees swallowed the road behind me, and the mansion disappeared into the fog. I kept driving, one hand on the wheel and the other in my pocket, feeling the weight of the pocket watch ticking softly against my fingers. I drove all the way back to town with the watch in my pocket and my mind racing faster than the rain on the windshield. I didn't even turn on the radio. The steady ticking from that little piece of metal felt louder than the engine. By the time I parked outside my apartment, it was already dark. But I sat in the van for a long time, staring at the empty building across the street, wondering what the hell I had walked into. When I finally went inside, the place felt smaller than ever. The cheap furniture, the stained carpet, the buzzing fridge in the corner. Everything seemed like a reminder of how far I'd fallen. I took the watch out, set it on the table, and just looked at it. My grandfather had touched this. Maybe even my father when he was a kid. I thought about how much my dad hated talking about his past. How he shut down whenever I asked about his father. Now I knew why. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept seeing George's face when he told me that the family had erased Edward's name. I couldn't stop hearing the words he used. If they knew you were here, they'd come again. The idea that people might still care enough to hide this secret after 70 years didn't make sense to me. But I felt the truth of it in my gut. The next morning, the sky was clear. I told myself I should focus on work. Pretend yesterday never happened. But by 10 o'clock I was already driving back toward Old Pine Road. I needed answers. I needed to see that letter again, to make sure I hadn't dreamed it all. The gate was open when I arrived. George was waiting at the door like he'd known I'd come back. He smiled when he saw me. "I slept 2 hours," he said. "But it was worth it. Come in." "Daniel, there's more you should understand." Inside, the house felt brighter, less heavy than before. Maybe it was the morning light cutting through the curtains, or maybe something inside me had changed. He led me to a sitting room I hadn't seen yet. It was lined with bookshelves and a large piano covered in dust. A photograph of a young woman sat on top of it. I stopped when I saw her. "That's Anna," he said. "She was beautiful. Wasn't she?" She was. Her face had that kind of warmth that makes you want to trust her. She didn't look like the kind of person who ruined a man's fortune. George sat down slowly on the couch. The world wasn't ready for them, he said. Edward didn't care about the money, but his father did. Charles Thompson built the family's empire. Banks, railroads, factories. He believed bloodlines should stay pure. Reputation above all. When Edward told him he wanted to marry Anna, Charles told him he'd rather have no son at all. I took a seat across from him. What did Edward do? He packed his things, took Anna, and left. They moved west for a while, ended up in California, then Oregon. He sent letters at first, but when none came back, he stopped. The family pretended he never existed. They even told your father that his parents had died in an accident. That kind of cruelty made something twist in my stomach. My dad had spent his life thinking he was unwanted, when in truth, he had been stolen from his parents. George leaned back, eyes half closed. Edward wrote me once, from a town near Sacramento. He said he didn't regret a thing, that love was worth more than a last name. Then the letters stopped. I always wondered what happened to them. I rubbed my face with my hands. So the Thompsons still have all that money? All that power? He nodded. The company is still around. Thompson Holdings. They run most of the real estate and banking in New England. The family is smaller now, but their influence is the same. They never let go of what they took. I thought about the anger that kind of legacy must have left behind. My father scraping by in a small garage while his own blood sat in mansions built on lies. George opened a drawer beside him and took out a thin folder. He handed it to me. Inside was a copy of an old will, typed on yellowed paper. It listed properties, accounts, and then a line that caught my eye. In the event of the heir's removal, the estate known as Whitmore is to be held in trust until rightful lineage returns. I looked up sharply. This house, he nodded. Edward's share of the estate was never legally transferred. The family thought they had closed every door, but they overlooked this one. I've kept the original documents safe, waiting for someone like you. The thought made me dizzy. I wasn't rich. I wasn't looking for inheritance. But knowing the truth was different. It meant everything my father had been denied wasn't because he wasn't good enough. It was because someone else decided he didn't deserve to exist. I leaned back in my chair. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He smiled faintly. Who would believe an old man with a dusty envelope? Besides, the last time I tried to talk, They threatened to take this house from me. They. You mean the Thompsons? Yes. I still get calls from their lawyers every few years, asking if I've found anything of Edward's. They think I'm too old to matter now. He looked at me carefully. That's why you have to be careful. The warning landed hard. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the long driveway. Your grandfather believed that the truth always comes home. Daniel, you found your way here for a reason. I didn't know if I believed in fate. But standing in that old house, holding the will that tied my name to it, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something had pulled me there. Before I left that day, George walked me to the door. He pressed the folded copy of the will into my hand. Keep this safe, he said. It's proof of who you are. I promised I would. Driving back, the world looked different. Every field, every passing car seemed sharper, more real. For the first time in years, I felt connected to something bigger than myself. When I got home, I put the folder on my kitchen table beside the watch. 2 pieces of history, both pointing to the same truth. My family had been erased, but not lost. I poured myself a drink and sat staring at them until the glass was empty. That night, as I drifted toward sleep, I dreamed of a man in a uniform standing beside a woman in a white dress. They were smiling, sunlight behind them, no fear in their eyes. When I woke, the watch was ticking softly on the nightstand, steady and alive, as if it had been waiting all along. Morning light spilled through the blinds and landed on the folder, and the watch still sitting on my table. I stared at them for a long time, letting the reality of what I'd learned sink in. My last name used to feel like a weight, a leftover from a family that never meant much. Now it felt like a door had opened, one that had been locked my entire life. I made coffee and sat at the table, flipping through the papers again. The old will, the letter, the photographs. Every page felt like a confession written in someone else's hand. My father's face came to mind, the way he used to shake his head whenever I asked about his dad. He had carried that silence his whole life. Now I knew it wasn't shame. It was a wound. I picked up the phone twice that morning, thinking about calling my ex, not to win her back, but because she was the only person who ever listened when I rambled about my past. But I didn't. Some stories you have to face alone. By noon, I couldn't sit still anymore. I needed to talk to George again. The road to Whitmore felt shorter this time, like I already belonged there. The gate was open again, and I saw George outside in the garden, pruning an overgrown rosebush. He waved when he saw me. You look like a man with questions, he said. I laughed nervously. You could say that. We walked toward the porch. The garden smelled of wet soil and old flowers. It felt peaceful. But under that calm there was something else. Something heavy that neither of us wanted to name yet. I told him I'd read everything again. About Edward. About Anna. About how the family erased them. He nodded. Quiet. There's more to it. Daniel, he said after a moment. Your grandfather wasn't the only one they wanted to forget. He motioned for me to follow him inside. We sat in the study where it had all started. He opened another drawer and pulled out a stack of faded news clippings wrapped in a rubber band. I recognized the family name printed in the headlines. Thompson Holdings expands east. Thompson legacy continues. But one clipping near the bottom looked different. Thompson scandal. Heir disinherited over love affair. The article was short, but the story hit like a punch. It talked about Edward's removal from the company, described the decision as necessary to preserve the integrity of the family business. No mention of Anna's name, only that she was an outsider. George's eyes met mine. They paid to keep her anonymous. They even altered legal records so she would disappear completely. I sat back in my chair, jaw tight. So they buried her twice. Once in life, once in history. He nodded. Your father never stood a chance of knowing who he really was. The company's lawyers made sure of that. They sealed every document tied to Edward's name. I ran my hand through my hair. Pacing the room, there was a part of me that wanted to walk away, to leave all of it buried. But another part, the one that had grown up watching my dad struggle to make rent while men named Thompson lived in mansions, couldn't let it go. I turned to George. Why did they keep Whitmore Estate if they hated him so much? He smiled faintly. Because they thought it was theirs. The land originally belonged to Edward's mother's side, not his father's. When Edward left, The paperwork got lost in the fight. They assumed they'd won. But they never followed through on the legal transfer. The house sat empty for years. I stayed to keep it from falling apart. He stood and reached for another folder on the shelf. This one looked newer, marked with red tabs. These are copies of the property deeds and some correspondence I kept hidden. If you want to make this right, these are where you start. Make it right. The phrase stuck with me. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the documents. Most were contracts and letters from company lawyers, trying to secure ownership of the estate. Buried among them was one letter written decades later by a younger family member, someone named Richard Thompson. The signature matched the name of the current CEO of Thompson Holdings. He was my cousin. Technically, though that word didn't feel right. The letter accused George of withholding property that belonged to the company. It ended with a threat to resolve the matter legally, if necessary. When I finished reading it, George sighed. He came here once, maybe 20 years ago, drove up in a black car with a driver, said he just wanted to talk. I told him the house wasn't his. He didn't like that. Did he ever come back? I asked. Not in person. Just more letters. But he'll hear about you eventually. That thought settled heavy in the room. I looked at the photographs of Edward and Anna again. My grandfather had given up everything to live honestly. Maybe it was time someone finished what he started. The rain started falling again outside. George stared out the window. His voice lower now. You remind me of him. You know. Same stubborn streak. Same need to make things right, even when it hurts. I didn't feel noble. I felt angry. Angry at a system that erased people like they were ink stains. Angry at my father's lost life. Angry that even now, after 70 years, the truth still needed defending. George turned to me. You have proof of your lineage now. But proof isn't always enough. They'll fight you. Let them. I said. He smiled sadly. That's what Edward said too. I left the house that evening with a box of documents under my arm. The air smelled of wet pine and something old. Like the house was exhaling after a long time. I loaded the box into my van and sat behind the wheel, watching the lights flicker through the rain. For a moment I thought about my father again. About how he died without ever knowing who he came from. I wondered what he'd say if he could see me now. Probably tell me to stay out of it. To let sleeping ghosts rest. But I wasn't him. I couldn't ignore this. I started the engine and looked one last time at the mansion in the mirror. Somewhere behind those walls were the last pieces of a story that had been buried for generations. I didn't know yet how deep it went. But I knew I wasn't done digging. The next few days passed in a blur of work and paperwork. I spent my mornings driving deliveries, and my nights going through the box of documents George had given me. Old property deeds. Court filings. Letters written in that same looping handwriting. Every page pulled me deeper into something I didn't fully understand, but couldn't walk away from. By Friday I decided to take a risk. There was a law office downtown that handled estate research and inheritance claims. I walked in carrying the box like it contained explosives. The receptionist pointed me to a woman named Claire Patterson, mid-40s. Sharp eyes behind a pair of black frames. She listened as I told her what I had found, then raised an eyebrow. This sounds like the plot of an old novel. Mr. Thompson. I smiled weakly. I wish it was. She looked through the documents, pausing at the will and the original seal from the Thompson estate. This is legitimate, she said finally. If the property was never officially transferred, technically it's still held in trust. But you'll need more than this. You'll need proof that you're Edward's direct descendant. DNA. I said quietly. Exactly. We can file a request for the family's archived medical and estate records. It may take weeks. But if you're serious, I can start today. I gave her the go-ahead, signed the forms, and left feeling both lighter and more terrified. That night I called George to tell him what I'd done. He sounded proud but also uneasy. Be careful, Daniel, he said. When money's involved, truth gets dangerous. He was right. The following week, things started to feel strange. I noticed a black sedan parked across the street from my apartment 2 days in a row. Maybe coincidence. But something in my gut told me it wasn't. One afternoon I came home and found my mailbox open. Papers scattered. Nothing stolen. but enough to make me lock the door twice. Then the phone rang. A man's voice. Smooth and calm. "Mr. Thompson. This is Richard Thompson. I understand you've been asking questions about my family." I froze. He went on as if reading from a script. "I admire curiosity, but I'd hate to see it lead you somewhere unpleasant. Perhaps we could meet. Clear things up." I didn't respond. He gave me a time and a place. A cafe near downtown. And hung up before I could say no. The next day I showed up early. Richard walked in wearing an expensive suit. Silver hair slicked back. The kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. He smiled like we were distant friends. "You really do look like him," he said as he sat down. "My great-uncle Edward. Shame about how his story ended." I studied him carefully. "You mean how your family erased him?" He laughed softly. "We preserved the Thompson name. That's not erasure. That's protection. The past is messy. Daniel. Better to let sleeping dogs lie." I felt heat rise in my chest. My father lived his whole life in poverty because of that protection. He leaned closer. Voice low. "You have no idea what you're getting into. Walk away. Take whatever small life you've built. And forget about this." I stood up. "You don't get to tell me what my name means." He smiled again. Polite but cold. Then he said, "I hope you don't regret this." And left. 2 days later, Claire called. The DNA results were in. A perfect match. I was the direct descendant of Edward Thompson. It felt surreal hearing it out loud. Like someone had finally confirmed a truth my blood already knew. She also mentioned something else. One of her assistants said someone had been inquiring about the case, trying to access the records we submitted. They claimed to represent me but couldn't provide ID. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking. That evening I drove to Whitmore. George opened the door before I could knock. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I told him everything. About the call. The meeting? The DNA test. His face grew pale. "Richard won't let this go quietly," he said. "He'll try to bury you just like he buried Edward. Let him try." I said. He gave a sad smile. "Edward said the same thing once." We sat in the study until late. The rain had started again, tapping softly on the windows. I felt the weight of every generation pressing down on me. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about setting something right that had been wrong for 70 years. When I got home that night, my apartment door was cracked open. The lights were off. But I could feel the air shift as I stepped inside. The box of documents was gone. I checked every corner, every drawer. Nothing. Only the watch on the table. Untouched. Ticking steadily in the dark. I called the police. Filed a report. But deep down I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were looking for. The next morning George called. Someone had broken into his place too. Papers scattered. Drawers open. But he'd hidden the originals somewhere safe. "We can't keep this quiet anymore," he said. "It's time to make it official. File the claim in court. Make them answer for what they did." I hesitated, thinking about Richard's warning, about the men who'd broken into my apartment. Then I looked at the watch again, ticking away on the counter like a heartbeat from another life. "You're right," I said. "Let's finish this." 2 weeks later, we filed the case in state court. Patterson handled the legal work. George gave a sworn affidavit. And the court accepted the petition to review Edward Thompson's estate. The date was set for a preliminary hearing in 3 months. After we left the courthouse, George looked up at the gray sky and exhaled. "I've been waiting my whole life for this," he said. I nodded. But something inside me tightened. I had a feeling the Thompsons wouldn't wait quietly for judgment. That night I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the image of Richard's smirk. The break-in. The missing papers. The watch ticked beside me, louder than ever, as if reminding me that the past wasn't done with me yet. The weeks leading up to the hearing felt like waiting for a storm to hit. Every day I woke up to the sound of that old watch ticking beside my bed. Each click a reminder that time was running out. Claire called often with updates. The Thompsons had hired one of the most expensive law firms in Boston. They were contesting every document we filed, every line of the old will, even the validity of George's testimony. It was obvious they weren't fighting for the truth. They were fighting to keep control. George and I met at Whitmore every few days to prepare. He seemed weaker lately, the cane shaking in his hand, his voice thinner than before. But when he talked about Edward, his eyes still had that spark. He wanted to live long enough to see the family answer for what they'd done. One afternoon, as we sat in the study surrounded by piles of paper, he said something that stuck with me. They've spent their lives pretending to be untouchable. The only thing they fear is exposure. Remember that when you face them. The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray. The courthouse in Salem looked like something out of another century. Tall columns and marble steps slick with rain. I stood outside for a long minute before walking in, trying to steady my breathing. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. On one side sat Richard Thompson with his team of lawyers in tailored suits. On the other sat Claire, calm and focused, and George beside her wrapped in his wool coat. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Then it began. Richard's attorney, a man named Klein, spoke first. His voice was smooth, polished. He claimed that Edward Thompson had voluntarily relinquished his rights decades ago, that no fraud had taken place, that any surviving claims were irrelevant due to time. He called me a distant relative chasing ghosts for profit. When it was our turn, Claire stood. She walked the judge through the will, the birth records, the DNA results. She explained how the trust for Whitmore Estate had never been dissolved. Her words were sharp, measured, impossible to ignore. Then it was time for testimony. George took the stand, gripping his cane, swearing the oath in a trembling voice. He spoke clearly, though, steady, despite the years weighing on him. He told the story of Edward and Anna, of the day Edward left the house with nothing but love and defiance. He talked about the letter Edward had sent him years later, the promise to protect the truth, the envelope sealed and hidden until I returned. When he finished, there was silence. Even the judge looked moved. Klein stood and started cross-examining. He tried to shake George's memory, throwing out dates, suggesting senility. But George didn't waver. When Klein asked if Edward had ever complained about being disinherited, George leaned forward and said quietly, "Edward didn't complain. He forgave. That's what makes your client's actions unforgivable." A low murmur went through the courtroom. Then it was my turn. My palms were sweating when I took the stand. Claire asked me about how I found the house, the envelope, the documents. I told them about the letter, the photographs, the pocket watch still ticking after 70 years. I could feel Richard's eyes on me the whole time. When Klein questioned me, his tone turned cold. He said I had no proof that Edward wanted to reclaim anything, that perhaps I was manipulating an old man for personal gain. I stared him down and said, "I'm not here for money. I'm here because my father died believing he was unwanted, and I refuse to let that lie be the last thing this family stands on." The judge called a recess after that. Outside in the hallway, George and I sat together on a bench. He looked exhausted, his hands shaking. "You did good," he said quietly. "Edward would have been proud." Before we went back in, Richard approached us. He waited until his lawyers were out of earshot. "You really think you're some kind of hero, Daniel?" he said. "You're dragging our name through the mud for a dead man." "Our name," I corrected. "And I'm not the one who buried it there." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You don't know what power really looks like." "Maybe not," I said. "But I know what fear looks like. I see it in you." He stepped back, his jaw tight, and walked away. The second half of the hearing moved quickly. Claire presented Edward's original letter and the matching signatures verified by a handwriting expert. Then she submitted a military record from the archives showing Edward's honorable discharge. The same signature, the same date as the letter to George. When the judge spoke again, the room went still. "Based on the evidence and testimony," he said, "the court recognizes Daniel Thompson as the direct descendant and rightful heir to Edward Thompson's estate and the Whitmore property." The words didn't hit me all at once. They sank in slowly, like water into dry ground. Richard's lawyers whispered among themselves, already planning an appeal. But the judge's gavel came down before they could speak again. "Case adjourned." George turned to me with tears in his eyes. "For 70 years, Daniel. 70 years waiting for justice. We walked out into the gray afternoon. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining under the weak sun. For a moment we just stood there, both of us quiet, breathing in the cold air. I offered him my arm as we headed down the steps. He took it, smiling faintly. "You've done what Edward couldn't," he said. "You gave him his name back." As we reached the car, he stopped to catch his breath. "You go on ahead," he said. "I'll be fine. I'll see you at home later." I nodded and got in the car. In the rearview mirror, I saw him still standing there on the courthouse steps, looking up at the sky like he was talking to someone I couldn't see. Driving back toward Whitmore, the watch ticked softly in my pocket, steady and alive. I didn't know what would happen next. The fight wasn't over. Not really. But for the first time I felt like the past had finally spoken, and it had chosen to tell the truth. When I pulled up to Whitmore that evening, the air was thick with the smell of rain and pine. The house looked the same as always, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. But something in me had changed. I wasn't just a delivery driver anymore. I wasn't the man who showed up here by accident. I was part of this story now, whether I liked it or not. Inside, the lamps were on, and a small fire burned in the fireplace. George was sitting in his favorite chair with a blanket across his lap. He looked tired but peaceful, his eyes reflecting the light like he'd been waiting for me. "It's done," I said quietly. "The court ruled in our favor." He smiled, slow and soft. I knew it would. Edward would finally rest easy. I sat down across from him. Richard was furious. "His lawyers are already planning to appeal." "Let them," George said. "Truth doesn't need to rush. It always catches up." For a long time we didn't speak. The crackling of the fire filled the room. I stared at the old photographs on the mantel, at Edward and Anna frozen in their moment of defiance. I wondered if they ever imagined that 70 years later, someone would be sitting here fighting to bring their names back into the light. George leaned his head back, closing his eyes. "I never told you what happened after Edward left," he said softly. "The family tried to ruin him. They blacklisted him from every bank and company he had helped build. He had to start from nothing. They called it punishment, but he called it freedom." I felt something twist in my chest. My father had spent his life trying to prove he was good enough. Now I saw that he'd inherited that same stubborn pride. George reached for his cane and stood, motioning for me to follow. "There's one more thing I need to show you before I'm gone," he said. Gone. The word hit me harder than I expected. I followed him down the hall to a small room at the end. He unlocked a cabinet and pulled out a leather-bound journal. It was old but well kept. He handed it to me. "Edward's diary," he said. The last entry was written 2 days before he disappeared. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat. The ink faded. The final words read, "I have no regrets. Love is the only inheritance worth leaving." George smiled faintly. He was a better man than all of them. "Promise me, Daniel. Don't let the past make you bitter. Use it to make things right." I promised. He seemed satisfied, then sank back into the chair, the weight of years settling over him. The firelight danced across his face, and for a moment he looked like the soldier in the photo again, strong and unbroken. That night I stayed in the house. The storm came back, wind rattling the windows. I couldn't sleep, so I walked through the halls, listening to the sounds of the old place settling around me. When I passed the study, I paused. The portrait of Edward caught the glow from my flashlight. For a second, I could swear his expression had changed, softer somehow. The next morning I found George still in his chair. His hands were folded on his lap, his eyes closed. He looked peaceful, like he had simply fallen asleep. The fire had gone out hours ago. I sat there for a while, unable to move. The man who had carried this secret for a lifetime was gone, leaving it in my hands. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, the priest from town, and me. I said a few words, mostly about loyalty and truth, about how one man can hold a promise for 70 years. When they lowered him into the ground, I slipped the pocket watch into his hands. It had belonged to Edward once. Now it belonged to him. Afterward, I went back to Whitmore alone. The house was quiet again, but not empty. I felt George everywhere, his cane leaning by the door, his cup on the kitchen counter. On the desk in the study sat an envelope with my name written on it. Inside was a letter. In his shaky handwriting he had written, "You've already done what needed to be done. Let the world know the truth. Tell their story. And don't let anyone take it from you." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Over the next few weeks, news of the court ruling started spreading. A journalist from the Salem Post reached out, asking for an interview. At first I said no, but then I remembered what George had written. When the article ran, the headline read, "Forgotten Heir Wins Back. Family Estate. Exposes Century-Old Scandal." The response was immediate. Some people called it inspiring. Others called it opportunistic. I didn't care. For the first time, Edward and Anna's names were printed together in a newspaper. Not as a scandal, but as a love story. Richard tried to fight back. He went on television, calling the ruling a technicality, claiming I had manipulated an old man. But the more he talked, the worse he looked. Reporters started digging into the company's history. Old documents surfaced, confirming everything we'd said. Within a month, Richard was forced to step down from the board. I watched it unfold quietly, not with satisfaction, but with a strange calm. Revenge didn't feel like I thought it would. There was no rush, no victory dance, just peace, the kind that comes when justice finally lands where it should. One evening I walked through the estate grounds as the sun was setting. The garden George had cared for was overgrown again, but the roses were blooming. I thought about how time keeps moving, how even after everything, life finds its way back. At the edge of the property, I found a small stone marker I hadn't noticed before. The engraving was simple. "In memory of Edward and Anna Thompson, love is the only inheritance worth leaving." I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind through the trees. For the first time since I'd stepped foot on this land, I felt like I was home. When I turned back toward the house, the lights in the windows looked warmer than they ever had. Inside, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, alive, waiting for whatever came next. The months after the ruling passed quietly. For the first time in years, life began to find its rhythm again. I spent most mornings walking the grounds at Whitmore, breathing in the scent of pine and wet grass, listening to the house creak as it settled into its new peace. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt earned. The lawyers called once or twice, mostly about paperwork and taxes. But I didn't care about the money. The estate was valuable, sure, but it wasn't what I had fought for. What mattered was the story, the truth that had finally clawed its way to the surface after 70 years underground. When spring came, I started restoring the house. It wasn't just repairs. It was reclaiming a piece of history. The broken windows were replaced, the faded wallpaper pulled down, the floors polished until they reflected the morning light. I kept the old photographs on the walls, the ones George had saved, and added a new one of him, smiling in the garden with dirt on his hands. By June, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to sell the property or turn it into another trophy for the Thompson name. I wanted it to stand for something better. I called Claire and told her I wanted to set up a foundation, a scholarship for kids who grew up like my father did, working hard but stuck in a world built by people with last names like Thompson. She smiled through the phone and said she'd take care of the paperwork. The Edward and Anna Foundation opened 6 months later. On the first day, I watched the first few scholarship recipients walk through the door. Kids from small towns. Kids who reminded me of myself before all this started. It felt like something finally closed inside me. Like a wound that had been bleeding for generations had begun to heal. I kept George's chair by the fireplace, just as he left it. Some nights I'd sit there with a glass of whiskey, reading through Edward's diary. His words were simple but powerful. He had written about faith, love, and the weight of family. One line always stood out to me. The truth can be buried, but it never dies. It waits. Those words lived in my head every day. One afternoon, in late autumn, a black car stopped at the gate. For a moment I thought it might be Richard, but the man who stepped out was younger, maybe in his 30s, with the same blue eyes that ran through our family. He introduced himself as Michael Thompson, Richard's son. I invited him in. He looked nervous, scanning the portraits on the wall as if seeing ghosts. We sat in the study, the same room where this all began. He told me his father had left the country, that the family business was being restructured. He said he'd read the court files and the newspaper stories and wanted to apologize. I studied him for a long moment. He was sincere. Lost. Maybe. The way I'd once been. I told him the truth didn't belong to me alone, that it belonged to everyone carrying the Thompson name, and it was up to him to decide what it meant now. Before he left, he looked around the room again. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "It feels like home." After he drove off, I stood by the window watching the leaves scatter across the driveway. Maybe that was what this whole thing was about. Not revenge. Not money. Just finding a way back home. That winter, the foundation held a small ceremony to honor Edward and Anna. I gave a short speech. Nothing grand. Just a few words about love and courage. The local paper covered it, calling it a story of redemption. I didn't correct them. Redemption sounded about right. Later that night, I walked through the house alone. The rooms were warm, the lights soft. I stopped by the study and looked at the portrait of Edward one last time before heading upstairs. The ticking of the old watch echoed faintly in my pocket. Standing there, I realized that everything I'd been running from, failure, loss, the shame of not belonging, had brought me exactly where I needed to be. Sometimes the past doesn't chase you to haunt you. Sometimes it just wants you to listen. I sat down by the fire, watching the flames dance. I thought about George, about the promise he kept. I thought about Edward and Anna, about how their love had survived even after they were gone. And I thought about my father, who never got to see the truth but who had passed it down to me anyway. Even without knowing it, I raised my glass to them all, to the generations that came before, to the ones who would come after. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. The next morning, I stood outside the house, watching the sunrise spill gold over the trees. The world looked wide open again, the way it must have looked to Edward when he walked away from everything. I smiled, feeling the same mix of fear and hope. The past was finally at peace. But the story wasn't over. It never really is. Stories like this keep moving, finding new voices, new hearts to live in. If you've ever felt lost, or buried by the weight of someone else's history, remember this: the truth always finds its way home. It might take years, or decades, but it always returns to the light. And if you're still here, listening to this story, then maybe you were meant to hear it. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you'd have done if it were your family. Maybe somewhere out there, another truth is waiting for you to bring it home too.